Good evening and welcome to what we hope is going to be I think equal parts fun and equal parts informative evening. Before we start, you know what I'm going to say. Please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. I promise I've done that with mine. I hope you've done that with yours. We are here today on behalf of Desi Writers Lounge to speak to a very unusual couple, two writers and social researchers who are working on two different topics, but topics that intersect significantly. Anam Zakaria is working on partition and has written a book called The Footprints of Partition, in which she's interviewed 4 generations of Pakistanis and some Indians, which is what the book says, some Indians, yes, talking to them about partition and asking for their stories and their viewpoints. In the meantime, Haroon has been looking at folklore, religious lore, and religious practices and rituals in Pakistan, and specifically in the Punjab area. The reason why these two come together, obviously, is because they pick up intersecting threads of communalism, communities getting along or not getting along, shared religious practices, and all of this in our particular era, I think the modern era, with the formation of Pakistan, the entire specter of nationalism based on religion, all of what they're researching comes together within that larger umbrella subject, basically. I'm not going to now start reading from a paper and telling you what their bios are. I'm going to ask them to tell you a little bit about what they've been doing. But before I do that, I just want to share that for me this evening is special because I met them for the first time in 2013 at the inaugural Lahore Literary Festival, where I was moderating a session on new writers from Pakistan. And these two were on a panel of 3 new writers. At that time, they were on the verge of publishing their first books. They weren't published yet. And since then, mashallah, Haroon has just published his 3rd book, which is incredible, by the way. And I said to you earlier also that we're all extremely jealous that you've been so prolific. And Anam has published this wonderful book, The Footprints of Partition, which I think also adds so much to this discussion. And now here we are today, in 3 years later, and they've done so much. So it's really, I think, very special for me to be here today and to be the one who's moderating this session. Now, if you could just tell the people here a little bit about yourselves and what you've done in the last few years.
Hello, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you Desi Writers Lounge and Alfia for having us here, as well as T2F. Okay, so I have an academic background in anthropology from LUMS, and ever since then I've been interested in writing. So a lot of my focus has been on alternative history in Pakistan. So I've been focused on non-Muslim heritage. So I've written a lot of articles on that. My first book is called A White Trail, and it's a book about religious minorities in Pakistan. So what I did was I attended their different religious festivals, and I documented my experiences as a travel log for that book. My second book is called In Search of Shiva, and this is a book about idiosyncratic Muslim shrines in Pakistan. By that I mean these sort of quote-unquote exotic shrines of sacred dogs, shrines of sacred cows, which usually practices that we don't really associate with Islamic or Muslim heritage, but these are practices that continue kind of not thriving, but continue existing in Punjab. Yeah, so that's my brief introduction.
So thank you, Desi Writers Lounge and T2F for having us as the first one in Karachi. So we're very happy to be here. I have a background in development, and that's what I work in. I work in the development sector, largely with education. But not just formal education, not just things like how many children are going to school or what kind of quality of education that's being imparted, but also the non-formal and the different ways that we get educated in one narrative or the other narrative. And that's how this book actually came out because I understood that partition wasn't just a historical event, but it's an ongoing process, and for many people, partition continues to play into their daily lives, and there's a certain version of partition or other historical events like the 65 war, the 71 war, that we learn. And then there's a process by which we need to unlearn and relearn to actually understand what history is, what our past is, what our heritage is like. So I've been working with the partition generation, with partition survivors for 5 years now, interviewing them. I largely work with oral histories. And currently I'm doing a similar project in Kashmir to try to understand through personal memories and personal stories what the conflict means. I'm also training to be a psychotherapist, which comes very handy when I'm doing interviews like these, because you're not only gathering information, but you're actually asking people to open old wounds and live through that trauma again with you. And many people, especially in the Kashmir context, are currently living in that conflict. So how do you go in as an outsider and try to probe, and then come back and do justice to those stories? So that's something I'm still struggling with, but also working on.
Okay, thank you for that. Reading your books, I got a clear sense of how much overlap there was in your research processes, and I would love for the audience to get to know you a little better in that respect before we move on to the major part of our discussion. You made a lot of these trips together within the Punjab, going to different villages, looking at shrines, learning about histories over there. You conducted your interviews also, I think, during that same period. As researchers who are working on these things separately, but yet probably bouncing ideas off each other, what do you feel you've learned and unlearned from each other? And how has that affected your interests, your research interests, that process of sharing what you're doing together? Is that too difficult a question to start with?
It's a good question. I've been waiting for someone to ask that. No one ever has, actually.
Yes.
I don't think I can imagine doing research without him. And the reason is because I actually started doing a lot of my research work with Haroon. And what happens is that when you have someone else to bounce your ideas off with, you get more clarity. So a lot of times we're going on the road and it's just both of us and we're traveling, and he'll notice graffiti on the walls, or I'll notice something, and we'll bring the other's attention to that. And it's actually mostly during these drives that we have these conversations where a lot of my ideas become crystallized. This is happening, this is not happening, and my biases get challenged. That's really important, because you're going in there, you're getting a glimpse, and you come back with these opinions. And then you have someone else who's saying, well, actually there's another way to look at it too. So this is that's one thing. But on another level, it really helps because having someone from an opposite gender is very crucial to the research process. There are a lot of times that I've been able to enter particular mosques or madrasas or gurdwaras where Haroon couldn't enter because there were women inside. So then I could go in and conduct those interviews. Similarly, when I'm working in Kashmir right now, a lot of people aren't comfortable talking to a lady. They become very closed. They have never interacted one-on-one like this, and they'll tell me, why don't you bring a man with you? Do you have a husband? Do you have a father? Do you have a brother? Where are they? And I can argue, and I can try to put myself out there and be very empowered, but at the same time, you have to respect the limitations, and I think it adds to the research process, and there's a lot that I've been able to do because he's always there.
Right. So you've been playing an enabling role.
I think definitely. It's definitely an enabling role.
Haroon, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I've never really admitted this, but a lot of times, so things that I pass off as what I've observed is actually what Anam's observed. So some interviews Anam's done, and I just project them as my interviews, and so I'm sorry for that. So I think the gender aspect is very important. Even with this book, we had to, so for example, one of the first shrines that we covered was that of phallic offerings, where women present phallic offerings to a Muslim shrine, and the idea is that that will bestow them with a child. And for that, I needed to talk to a few women, but at a village, it was very difficult. So Anam actually went out there, and she actually went inside the houses and talked to them. So those are really important sort of aspects of the book. Also, I think, so there is this overarching themes in our work which sort of coincide. So that is more about identity, more about nationalism, or, so those questions. But within that, of course, we have a very different interest. So I'm more about, my interest lies more in syncretism or lack of it, or on religious traditions and how the religious kind of culture is changing. With Anam, it's a little more political. So I think, and that really helps. So she gives me that kind of dimension for my writing. And with her book, not with this, but maybe for her next book, Kashmir book, that's sort of what I kind of bring to the table.
Right, and I think they've been, you in particular have quoted some very interesting conversations that have happened between the two of you while you've been out on your trips. I think one of the funniest ones being the Seal. Do you want to tell the audience that? Anam learned something slightly unpleasant thanks to Haroon's knowledge of folk history.
Yeah, so we were, for the shrine, for the course of the book, we were going to the shrine of Heer, at Jhang. So it's a very famous folk legend from Punjab. And Heer was a Seal. And Anam, of course, from her mother's side, is a Seal. And then on the way, we stopped at the village of Mirza Sahiban, which is another really popular folk legend from Punjab. And Mirza and Sahiban was also a Seal. And then there's a really interesting, so in the legend, there's a really interesting dialogue between Mirza, the protagonist, and his mother, whereas Mirza's mother, the mother-in-law of Sahiba, is asking Mirza not to go and chase Sahiba. And she quotes Heer. And she says that, see what Heer did to Ranja, she drove him crazy, and these Sial women can never be trusted. Yeah, and the story even becomes more fascinating for me because my ancestral village is next to Ranja's ancestral village.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so I'm from Mid Ranja.
Look at that.
Yeah. So I'm from Mid Ranja, which is right next to Takht Hazara, where Ranja is supposed to be from. So I just sort of had this romantic association where I'm from Ranja's village and Anam's Seal. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Okay, that's great to know. Okay, so now let's move on to a little more about what you guys have been writing about in your books and how these things come together. I have to say I've really enjoyed your work, yours, and I think I've learned so much in the process of reading these books. I'd like to take a historical view of the things that you've looked at. So let's start with you, Haroon. You've been covering these religious practices, particularly in the folk context, right? Rural areas and so on. And you've been finding, as you said, idiosyncratic practices which are not so easy to find nowadays, particularly in urban centers. But you've been discovering them, these little bubbles of absurdity in some way, but also, history and something which is perhaps in many ways more representative of how historically religion used to be practiced here. Could you tell us about, much before partition, historically speaking, what did you find in the process of your research? What were the traditions, particularly around the Punjab, where your research was?
Okay, so I think that's something that we were also having a conversation upstairs. So one thing that happened, after partition, it sort of became crystallized, but even before partition, these religious identities were fluid. So you will see, so for example, in Nepal, which was never colonized, those identities are still very fluid. So where somebody would be a Hindu, but they would also be a Buddhist at the same time. You would find a very similar situation in China as well, which also was never colonized. So what happened with the advent of the British, because the British they were coming from a very Enlightenment period, a modernistic era, so they had very clear-cut notions of what identity should be. So if you are a Christian, then you cannot be a Muslim. Or if you are a Hindu, then you cannot be a Muslim or a Sikh for that matter. But that's not how we kind of saw ourselves. Not to say that things were perfect, rosy. Of course, there were people like Guru Nanak or Bhagat Kabir talking about Hindu-Muslim sort of conflicts, which means that there has to be something on the ground, which was contradicting the syncretism. But with the advent of the British, and especially with the census reports, with the written kind of culture, the identities became much more crystallized. Castes became much more crystallized. So the idea is, we think of ancient India where castes were very hierarchical and they were never kind of overlapped, but there are stories of people from the lower caste becoming upper caste. But with the advent of the written word, which we kind of glorify, and ironically we as writers also kind of, we are part of that tradition, but what it does is it kind of crystallizes things.
Yes.
And that's what British did.
The codification of identities, basically.
Yeah. And I think in a way partition is kind of a product of that. I mean, that happened in Rwanda, the Hutu and the Tutsi kind of civil war was also a direct product of that crystallization of ethnic identities. And then, of course, with partition, on one hand, is a product of that crystallization, but what it also did, it kind of aggravated that situation. And now, of course, we have very clear ideas of what Hindu is, what Muslim is, and they are separate, they never overlap. But I mean, so that's essentially what the focus of the book has been.
But before the partition era, and I know that's a huge period of time, but historically, what were these folk religious practices like? What did you discover during your journey? How did these fluid identities operate at the community level?
I think one kind of problem is that even I am a product of the written word of those crystallized identities. So I think, like objectively, I can perhaps never really understand what they were. But I'll give you an example. So there's a shrine that I covered. It's called the Ram Thaman's shrine. It's a shrine near Kasur. And it's a Hindu shrine, as we know the name says. Today, it still has a very huge Baisakhi festival in April. And this festival is completely attended by Muslims. So no Hindus, no Sikhs ever go there. The Muslims go there. And they know it's a Hindu temple, and they present chadar to the shrine. And these are Muslim devotees who go and present, go to this Hindu shrine. Now, so in our modern language, I mean, this is a very structural issue. So when I will write about it, I will say that Muslims are going into a Hindu shrine.
Right.
But that's not necessarily how they understand that.
No, it's devotees going to a shrine.
So I think for me, objectively, perhaps I can never really understand what it was. We can only get a glimpse of what it means. So there was no contradiction in being a Muslim and being a devotee of Hindu shrines. I mean, I've interviewed Hindus who used to visit Data Darbar very regularly, and they found no contradictions in that. In Sikhism, for example, Baba Farid is revered as much as any other guru. And they see no contradiction in that, and even Farid's follower kind of also accept Guru Nanak as their saint. But the irony is that today, in order to kind of acclaim Guru Nanak, what we need to do is say that he was actually a Muslim. So how modern understanding is kind of reinterpreting history and historical processes.
Now, what you found was that a lot of the practices, the religious practices in these villages could be traced back to the cult of Shiva, of Lord Shiva, right? Could you tell the audience a little bit more about that? Because that's something which I found to be quite surprising. I didn't think itni clear connections hongi, jitni ki you've actually shared in the book. So could you just give a few examples of the practices that you found which were directly traceable?
Yeah. I think it's also very shocking for me. So when I started looking at these shrines, I saw them as just particular cases. But when I went back home and I did some research, so let's say the shrine of phallic offerings is clearly a fertility cult. And Shiva began as a fertility god. He still is represented as a phallic. And Shiva also is a very interesting character because he is part of the indigenous religious tradition. So we found the earliest forms of Shiva worship have been traced from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. So the idea is that the Aryans kind of adopted Shiva. So he was actually rejected as a bad deity in the start. But eventually, so now he's become, in the past, let's say 100 years, Shiva is kind of owned by mainstream Hinduism. He's always been a pariah deity. So similarly, so there was another shrine of sacred dogs, where it's a Muslim shrine where dogs are considered sacred because they were associated with the Peer. So even today, his devotees offer meat to the dogs, and the idea is that would somehow get them the blessings. And I was when I went back home, I did my research, and I found out that Shiva, in one of his incarnations, also has a pack of dogs. And one of his temples, I'm forgetting where it exactly is, but has an exactly same tradition where Shiva's dogs are presented with meat, and the idea is that would give them Shiva's blessing. Similarly, another chapter is on transgenders. And Shiva also kind of links back to it because Shiva is actually a male and a female combined. So Shiva is half male, half female, and a lot of anthropologists kind of say that the mystic kind of association that we have with transgenders in India and Pakistan kind of goes back with the fascination of Shiva, where the idea is that these transgenders kind of possess these spiritual, mystical powers. You don't mess with them. So
Right.
there's a lot of connections from that.
And as you said in your book, on the one hand, these are, whether dogs or when you come into, people, eunuchs again, these are things that are sort of, people tend to say, कि नहीं भाई, मतलब दूर रहो इनसे, So dogs are considered unclean generally by Muslims. Eunuchs again considered holy in some ways, but then also made fun of and treated very badly and not even recognized officially until very recently. So as citizens, so there are these. There's this dichotomy over here in terms of, on the one hand, you have something that you try to stay away from, and on the other hand, you feel that it is integral to your worship. So,
but that's actually also really interesting, because in Shiva worship, there's a tantric sect, and in the Sufi Islam, you have the Malanti Sufis, who actually, so this concept of sacred and profane.
Right.
So what they do is they make the profane sacred,
right.
Kind of deriding the society and kind of sort of earning their disdain, and for them that's a way of connecting with God. So there's actually even in Islamic tradition, there is this tradition of worshipping things which are regarded as impure.
In order to show yourself to be humble, in order to show that I'm not so proud of my spiritual powers, right? Did you find during your travels that these practices are on the rise, or do you feel that they're slowly whittling away with the passing years?
Okay, so I think what's happened is there's a number of things that happened. So first big shock to these practices came after partition, where suddenly we had a new country which was created on the basis of religion, as popularly understood. So a lot of these practices at that time were reinterpreted. So a lot of shrines which perhaps were earlier Hindu shrines or Muslim or Sikh shrines suddenly converted over time. And so, for example, in Sialkot, I went to a shrine which is where beri ka darakht is sacred. Now, so worshipping of beri ka darakht is also an ancient tradition, but after partition, what happened was that a grave was made there to kind of give a sanction, to kind of sanctify that practice. So it was changed. And the second biggest blow, according to what I think, came after 9/11, primarily because then there was a introspection kind of started.
Who are we?
Yeah, so the whole idea, so Islamic revivalist movements began after 9/11, and that also, made a huge blow to the shrines, where a lot of these shrines were not regarded as pure, proper Islamic shrines. So yeah, so they actually, so now they're finishing, more or less. So even the shrine of the sacred dogs, the dogs are now slowly being chased away. So a few years ago, there were like 40, 50 dogs who used to always be at the shrine. Now they're like 10, 15.
Right.
And even with the phallic offerings, earlier they were all over. Now they're slowly being removed to kind of purify the
Right. And you'd
practices.
also mentioned how there's a process of appropriation. In some cases, the practices are continuing, but are being slowly appropriated by more puritanical Muslim practices. That's interesting. So, Anam, now that we've gotten a sense of the history behind this, I'd like us to move on to the partition era. And what did your interviews and stories tell you about what people now today living in Pakistan have been either told by their ancestors about the pre-partition time or what they remember themselves, if old enough at the time of partition, what they remember themselves of that time in terms of communities interacting, and particularly with the religious festivals and practices.
So when I started this research, I think, like Haroon, I'm a product of a security state. I'm a product of a post-partition generation where identities are very, very crystallized. So when I was going in, I had a very linear understanding of history. Pre-partition means Muhammad bin Qasim came and rid this land of the infidels, and then partition happens, and then we purified.
So our history began.
And then the history began, right? And it began from a very violent episode, because I was always only taught about the bloodshed and brutality of partition. So when I was going in and interviewing, I already was asking questions based on my biases. So I was asking for questions I was asking for answers basically that would reaffirm my belief that something, we needed to separate because we could not coexist.
We were
that was
different.
the premise, right?
Yeah.
But slowly, as I started to do these interviews, I realized that there was coexistence. And there's so many traditions that continue even till today. So there's this mela that happens at the border in Kasur, which I can read about later, where Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs still come together, and Indians and Pakistanis come together. So it's right on the zero line, there's a shrine, and is revered by all three religions, and people come together. And while I was interviewing someone over there, he said, my father was a Sikh, and this is a Muslim gentleman. Now, for me, that's very odd, and I just sat there and I looked at him for a couple of minutes, and I said, what do you mean your father is Sikh? Would you like me to read that?
Could you read that passage? Because I think that would be fantastic at this point, just to see how these identities were so effortlessly fluid. And ठीक है, communities उस वक्त भी आपस में लड़ती थीं because of these differences in religion. But it's incredible how they used to interact.
So we are in Kasur, and we had gone there to interview someone else who wasn't home, and we end up entering this house of this nice gentleman who just invited us in for drinks. So it was very, very hot. So Iqbal Sahib explains to Ashik that I wanted to speak with his uncle regarding his visits to India in the early years. He laughs and responds in Punjabi, then you should have come here a few days later, on 3rd Sawan. A huge mela is held that day, where Indians and Pakistanis come together to pray at a mazar just on the zero line. I lean forward with interest, wanting to know more about the festival that brings together two historic enemies. However, despite belonging to Lahore, a city that lies at the heart of Punjab, I have never been taught to speak Punjabi as part of the modern education system, and have only recently started to learn it on my own. It is, after all, seen as an uncultured language, confined to the rural corners, not suitable for the educated and civilized elite. I turn towards Haroon and ask him to translate for me. He is more fluent than I am. I want to know everything about this mela. The mela, as we find out, has been held since before partition and continues till date. Indians and Pakistanis both attend under the vigilant eyes of the rangers. They bring food and mithai and greet each other from across the line. First, the Indian group is allowed to pray at the shrine, and then the Pakistani lot. If I'm to believe Nasir Ashik, the border, which is meant to divide on the basis of religion, serves as a source of connection for Indians and Pakistanis for religious reasons itself. Together, they come to offer their prayers in their own customary manner at a shrine that they both revere and respect. A shrine that is Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim, each to his or her own. Religious and geographical distinctions come to be blurred at the line of division itself. This is paradoxical, almost self-contradictory, to say the least. Born in the late 80s, I have grown up hearing stories about Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh divisions, about how the communities could not live together, primarily because they could no longer practice their religion side by side. A new country had to be formed. Muslims were a separate nation. Their practices were at extreme variance with the non-Muslims of India. They worshipped multiple idols. We worshipped one Allah. There was nothing mutual. There were no grounds for unity. Separation was necessary. To hear that Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims could seek blessings at the same shrine, that they could come together to greet, hug, and celebrate together is an anomaly for me. To unite, on top of that, at the very border which is meant to divide, is almost satirical. For Nasir Ashik, however, this is the only normal that he knows. Later, I'm to find out that there are many other such melas that take place across the country. At some of these, for instance, at Baisakhi at Ramthaman in Kasur district, local Muslims and non-Muslims come together to celebrate, while at others, the festivals take place at the LOC or other lines of division across the country. And Indians and Pakistanis come forward in celebration from both sides. It was here, at this mela, that my father, Sarafdeen, met with a Sikh family after 1947 for the first time. Sikh family? His father was a Sikh? Taken aback, I interrupt him in English, looking at Haroon in complete confusion, while Ashik in return looks at me puzzled, unsure of what I just said in the foreign language. I ask Haroon to confirm whether Nasir Ashik belongs to a Sikh family that continued to stay on this side of the border. That would be most fascinating, for in a land of 3% minorities, it is not common to run into non-Muslims. But no, he answers, I'm a Muslim, and so was my father, but he was adopted by a Sikh in India before partition. He didn't have any children, so he asked my grandparents to give him my father. I wonder how Sarafuddin's parents felt about him having a Sikh upbringing, but Ashik brushes off my questions with a shrug. It holds no value for him, nor is it something that has concerned him. For Ashik, the situation is simple. The Sikh gentleman brought up my father with so much love and devotion that my biological grandparents were only happy, and as a reward, God graced him with 4 sons and a daughter later on. His other sons, my chachas, were called Sacha Singh, Acha Singh, Bajna Singh, and Khoja Singh. He doesn't find it necessary to mention the daughter, his aunt's name. The Sikh family was my father's real family. Even when the partition riots broke out and Sikhs and Muslims were killing each other, the Sikh gentleman ensured that my father was safely sent to Pakistan. Sarafuddin was 55 at the time of partition and looked just like a Sikh, wearing a pagri and a beard matching that of his father and brothers. To me, this sounds almost surreal. A Muslim boy with a Sikh father and Sikh brothers and sisters. However, I'm told that contrary to what most Pakistanis and Indians like myself believe today, such hazy divisions were common in the pre-partition days, when communities intermingled with each other, their identities getting diluted in the process. Ashik, unlike myself, has grown up hearing such stories from his father. His understanding of the other is not rigid like mine, nor is the division between India and Pakistan and Indians and Pakistanis as stark. Living at the border, where he can see Indians across from him, further reiterates the arbitrariness of the lines of division. Despite the armed forces and border controls, he has probably come into contact with far more Indians than the ordinary Pakistani. They are not strange and imaginary figures for him, but instead are a part of his daily existence.
It's so interesting. You know, one of the things which I loved about your book, Anam, is that you're constantly questioning yourself. Okay, constantly. And I think that's the mark of a good researcher and the mark of a good writer, that you are never imagining that your process of research is in any way completely disconnected from what's, from the information that you're getting. And one of the things which I noticed you questioning was your own elite education, your elite background, and I think that that's something that's very important to talk about and to consider in these things. You see, I'm just thinking the partition and other events that happen are obviously experienced differently by different people. Right? So those who were poor and who did not have anyone to turn to, the process of migration for them would have been dramatically different from people who had connections in the government and who were migrating knowing that their lives were relatively safe, right? Obviously, at some level, one could also say that because partition was overall so violent and so unexpectedly violent, there were a lot of people who suffered, who perhaps felt that they could have gotten away with more, without losing their lives or their families, but they still suffered. Ye dono cheezein saath saath chal rahi thi, right? But the idea that the elite might experience these things differently and then tell those stories differently and then ask questions differently based on these things. How did you feel about that during these interviews? Your own background and the backgrounds of the people who you were interviewing, the rich versus the poor. What differences did you find?
I think for myself as a researcher, it took me a really long time to even realize what I was doing wrong.
Right.
So for the longest time, I had been conducting these interviews for 2 years, and with a very generic understanding. And even when someone would mention a Hindu friend or a Sikh friend or a celebration or something that didn't fit the narrative that I was expecting, I would brush it away. I'd be like, okay, this happened, but it must have been an exception. Why delve into it? Someone would mention I was rescued by a Sikh or a Hindu, and I'd be like, oh, that's wonderful. But that was wonderful. That was an anomaly.
Let's move on to the real stories.
Let's move on to the real story, right?
Right.
Where are the gory details? And actually, one of the most interesting feedback I've gotten to the book is from a friend who said, the book is nice, but it didn't do much for me. So I said, okay, tell me. He said, there's no gore and bloodshed. And that's what partition is, and you've hardly mentioned that. You haven't engaged with it. All the stories are so rosy. And I think that's what happens because we've been taught about partition in a certain way. We've been taught about our history in a certain way where we were uprooted, but there was all this bloodshed that absolutely existed. But we haven't looked at it from a wider lens. So partition is a violent tragedy, but what more does it mean? And if you're not getting those stories, you're not getting satisfied because that's what you're looking for. So it took me a very long time to get rid of my own biases, but then I started to realize that there is no one partition narrative. One thing that I think we do as researchers whenever we're looking or studying about the past is romanticize it. And you have to be very careful. So one way I could have gone is say everything before partition was wonderful and then partition happened and ruined everything. And that's true for some people, especially for divided families. They'll say it wreaked havoc with us, But then there are others for whom it makes sense. There's some who were rescued by Sikhs and were also tortured by Sikhs. So how do they make sense of those dichotomies? And I think the only lesson I've learned from all these interviews is that partition needs to be looked at on a spectrum. And the same people who will talk about the tragedy will also talk about good memories, and you need to probe to get all the stories out because we've been taught to ask questions and share stories that fit the state narrative, and the other more nuanced memories won't come out. But everyone has both. To a different degree. Those people, to answer your income question, a lot of people who didn't suffer at all at partition share the more happier memories.
Right.
So the children will grow up with almost an indifference. They'll either have nostalgia or they'll be like, okay, it was very tragic, our parents lived through this, there was this larger kind of collective memory of the bloodshed, but we've been able to move on, and we have fresh relationships. They also have the access to the other, because they have exposure, they have money, they travel, they go to universities abroad.
Absolutely.
So they have a very different understanding.
So they get to interface with people from India at a totally different level.
They do, but at the same time, I don't want to be simplistic and make an argument that the rich people didn't suffer and they share certain oral histories and the poor people share different, because you'll actually notice that a lot of elite families, the oral histories that are coming in from there are very filtered as well, because sitting in Punjab, being part of the elite class, you're also endorsing, and you're part of the Pakistan project. You're part of the Pakistaniyat, the Punjabi project, the two-nation theory project.
Absolutely,
so
absolutely. Very much an elite narrative.
Or subconsciously learn to filter those memories and only share a certain aspect of it. And even children in very elite schools are growing up with a lot of biases. So my friends from Lahore American School, which is your elite, you'd be shocked to see hear some of their opinions. So it's not that you can't make a simplistic argument that madrasson mein ya low income schools mein ye padhaya jata hai and upper income is all better.
लेकिन partition की experience जो थी, जो उसकी memories जो थी, the people who lived through it, during the course of your interviews, did you find any difference in what you were hearing from, say, the diplomat versus the person who was living in a village on the line of control?
I think geography really made a difference. Class did make a difference. Where the whole Mahajar issue made a difference. So what you came expecting and what happened or did not happen, how that makes you look back at partition. Because you have to understand, memories are not objective, honest facts, right? They're a way that we remember. We choose to remember in a certain way.
Absolutely.
And also it's very important to note that a lot of these personal memories have been hijacked by collective memories.
Absolutely.
So most people, not most, well, a lot of people that I spoke to who had not lost a single family member still spoke about the collective tragedy of partition and had personalized it as their own. So my grandmother, for instance, she came from an elite background. She was situated in Lahore at partition. She worked at a refugee camp. And for the longest time, she only shared the stories about the bloodshed and trauma. And when I probed, and I was writing this book at the age of 25 when I went back, for the first time I heard about her Hindu and Sikh friends. For the first time I heard about a family getting rescued by a Sikh family.
She'd just been conditioned not to tell the stories where people from different communities were actually helping each other. She'd been conditioned to tell the stories where they were killing each other.
Yes, and on one level, psychologically, those are the stories that kind of get imprinted in your mind, and the other ones
because
get hijacked.
Tragedy tends to trump everything else.
But yes, there were class differences, and there were, gender played a huge role, how women retell partition versus how males retell partition, city versus villages, all of that played a role.
Could you talk about the gender aspect of it? Because I'd love to hear about that.
So with women, you see silences more than words.
Oh, interesting. That's very different from the picture that's usually drawn of
So,
them.
when I was interviewing women, what would happen was a lot of times there'll be men in the room who would hijack the narrative. So they would just come in and start talking, and women would become very quiet. Even when there were women alone, there were a lot of silences. And alongside those silences, there was this one repeated question that I kept getting. Why are you asking us? हमने क्या देखा है? उनसे बात करें. My husband used to go out. He was part of the political, movement at the time, or my father was, or my brothers were. Why aren't you asking them? So I realized over time that not only do men see women as bystanders of history, women see themselves as bystanders of history, as spectators,
So interesting.
rather than participants. And another thing is that we haven't really probed female narratives enough, or Rishi Battaglia has, but not enough because it's been linked to honor. To uncover female narratives, there's a question mark on honor because a lot of women were killed.
Right, and honor was such a big question
and still
during
is.
partition and
Yes.
during migration, to say that women, to imagine that women would sort of consider themselves bystanders in spite of that.
So for most of the women that I spoke to, their trauma had never been heard. They were not used to sharing it. One lady fainted right after I interviewed her. Because I don't think she had ever spoken about it. Another lady said, I thought partition meant mangoes in Ambala in the summer and oranges in Sargodha in the winter.
Wow.
And she said, and then the next thing I knew, I could never go back. So it's very different with gender. Yeah.
One absolutely shocking thing, I'm going a little off track here, but one absolutely shocking thing from which I saw from your book was how many people actually didn't realize that partition was happening. These are not people just in remote villages in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. We're talking about people who are actually quite well placed in society. And a number of people have said things like, "Hum to garmiyon ki chuttiyon ke liye gaye the, and we thought we were coming back." So we're talking ke June tak, till June 1947, there were people who were leaving their homes thinking, "Acha, we'll just be back in 3 weeks," not realizing what was about to happen, which is it gives a sense of how fast everything moved and how little planning and implementation there was, and therefore how much havoc happened because of that, just because things weren't planned properly. And I imagine that would have really added to the trauma. No one was ready for it. No one knew what it was actually going to mean, right?
No one knew what it meant.
Yeah.
Even if you were for partition or against partition, you didn't know what partition meant.
Yeah, yeah. And the idea that aage jaake, most of us will never be able to go back. I think I got that sense of yearning very strongly from the interviews that you did. People wanting to go back again and again to reconnect.
That was very shocking for me. Because again, I was coming from this understanding that we had gotten rid of the ugly past, right? And when people are saying, well, we are dying to go back, it's a dying wish. And I was turning around and saying, but weren't you supposed to be happy about coming to Pakistan and you're saved and, why would you want to go back? And, it's so strange now when I laugh at myself, but I actually thought that that physical, geographical divide would also cut the emotional cord, which it doesn't.
Right.
And a lot of people said, when we moved to India or to Pakistan, we didn't think it really meant anything.
Right.
We thought we'd belong to both lands. We still belong to both lands. You don't see it that way, but we still do.
Yeah, yeah. So now we covered the partition period. We are going to fast forward a little bit now. The last few decades. We've seen, as we see from your book also, Haroon, we've seen a particular sort of puritanical Islam slowly beginning to sort of rise and sort of form a very visible sort of identity, a very visible political identity. And that puritanical version of Islam is now beginning to infringe quite majorly on smaller communal practices, basically, which are reflective of other religions, right? Within the new revivalist movements that we are seeing in modern-day Pakistan, say Al-Huda, okay, or say more of the sectarian issue that seems to be coming up. What is your understanding of those? How does that connect to partition, in your point of view?
Right. So for one thing that I argue in the book as well is, I think it's wrong to call them revivalist movements because revival implies that you're going back to certain traditions and bringing them back. With these new Islamic revivalist movements, like Al-Huda, for example, there is no revival. These are absolutely new movements. So there is no sort of revival for that matter. Now, I actually interviewed one of my professors, Sadaf Ahmed, who has written a book on Al-Huda, and I've included that chapter as an interview. What she kind of identifies is that a lot of women who are inspired by Al-Huda. So Al-Huda, for those of you who don't know, is a very popular movement in Islamabad, especially women movement, which kind of promotes a puritanical version of Islam, literal version of Islam. You should go back to the Quran and read yourself. Don't rely on anybody's interpretation. I mean, sounds fascinating, sounds how it should be. So what happens is that these kind of movements are very attractive to educated people, because this is once again relying upon the word. It is relying upon your certain literacy level, that
the ability to read.
Yeah, so the idea that you should be able to read and interpret it. But it's actually, so the whole interpretation actually, so the implication is that it will be your own interpretation, but it actually is not. It's a product of various influences that have inspired you all your life. Now you are a product of a certain educational system, which kind of goes back or links our national identity to an Islamic identity, as you mentioned, Muhammad bin Qasim. So with that kind of a background in education, these movements become very attractive.
So interestingly, now we're again looking at an elite narrative again that is developing over here. We're looking at particular movements that are popular amongst particular circles. People, as you said, who can read, people who can afford to fund organizations like these. So again, it's an elite narrative, once again, which challenges our view, which I think is held all too commonly, that it's the poor who are radicalized, okay? Which is a very lazy assumption that most of us, I think, make at some point, whereas what we're actually seeing is something different.
It's,
and the Tablighi Jamaat also, as you mentioned in your book.
Yes, so most of their devotees or followers come from the middle class. In fact, come from the upper class. If you go to, if you've ever visited Lahore, you'll know that a majority of the supporters are actually part of the elite. I mean, we've had people like, let's say, Junaid Jamshed, people like Inzamam, people like Saeed Anwar. These are educated people who've been all over the world. So these are not illiterate, backward village people. These are educated, middle class, upper middle class who are attracted to this movement. And once again, it goes back to what kind of education they're receiving. Now, every nation uses education as propaganda. I mean, that's not unique to us. India does it, America does it, but that has problems. So with Pakistan, the propaganda is against Hindus, is about Islamic nationalism. And then, I mean, of course, then it raises question about what is true Islam. And then, of course, because our nation is also built upon this separation from Hinduism, then true Islam is not which intermingles Hinduism and Islam. It has to be something which is unique, something which is separate, which is exclusive. So that's how education and your educational background kind of overlaps. Also, I think another aspect with middle class is that, I mean, once again, it may be a simplistic argument, but perhaps they can more afford to ask questions like this. Perhaps.
Oh, that's so interesting, right? They're less worried about ke kaun pakad ke marega.
Yeah, because I mean, religion is also very strongly linked with materialism. Because the more ingrained you are, or more part of you are, the more sort of engaged you are with the capitalist system, the more kind of a moral vacuum emerges. I mean, I sound like a Marxist here, but but the idea.
So what?
Yeah, but the idea that we kind of live in a global system where these kind of where this pursuit of money is seen as the end goal. Now, of course, human beings are, as Karen Armstrong argues, spiritual being, and we need some kind of a spiritual justification for our actions, and capitalism, unfortunately, does not give us. I mean, neither does communism, but that's a different debate. So in that matter, so when you have attained a certain kind of status, you then kind of need a need for religion to become, to kind of look back to your roots. And that's how it also overlaps.
So you become primed for this kind of come back to religion.
I mean, so many times I've been told that, I mean, I'm still young, but when I'm older, then I'll discover religion. And that's the idea, that the older you are, the more successful you are in life, the need for religion also increases.
Right, and the more you remember कि अब time खत्म होने वाला है. That's while you were talking, I remembered this particular part of your book that I'd highlighted, and I wonder if you could read this for us, in fact, because I think it sums it up really well, actually. These notions where nationalism and religion intersect for us in modern day Pakistan.
All right. So this chapter is called the two-nation theory. So what I've done is I haven't just looked at these shrines. I've also tried to place these shrines in a certain context. So what does these shrines now mean in Pakistan? Which is why I felt there's a very important need to talk about Pakistani nationalism. So this part is, here it goes. Having strict notions of what it means to be a Muslim, defined as something that is not Hindu or Sikh, the educated people in the country who are part of the elite have reinterpreted Islamic religious practices, adopting sects and schools of thought that are more puritanical in nature. They believe Sufi shrines and religious traditions that are inspired by non-Muslim practices or are syncretistic, are impure, and need to be shunned. It is primarily for these reasons that shrines, which are located in developed areas, where people are more educated, are losing their idiosyncrasies much faster than those found in remote regions.
Haroon, just to interrupt, when you say developed areas, do you mean specifically urban centers, or do you mean even areas and neighborhoods within rural sort of areas which are doing better?
Yeah. So I think, so one reason why, let's say, Punjab has seen much more puritanical movements than Sindh or Balochistan for that matter is because Punjab is more developed.
Right.
So I mean even small cities.
Okay.
For example, in today's Pakistan, the hub of religious terrorism might be Jhang,
Right.
where Lashkar-e-Jhangvi comes from. So
Right.
that will also be a developed area.
Right. Okay.
So small cities, even big cities. So given these circumstances, it would be safe to say that Muslim fundamentalism, not defined as militancy but puritanism, is more popular in the urban centers compared to the rural. Growing up in this environment, I was no different from the average Pakistani student who thought of Indians as others and believed that we as Muslims and Pakistanis were everything that Indians were not.
Right.
It was only when I started exploring the folk religion of the country that I began to fully understand the issues at hand. I was fascinated by Pakistan's non-Muslim heritage, but for me, it was separate from my heritage. Through these shrines, I began to understand that at a folk level, where the primordial identity of a society is not tinged by nationalistic fervor and religious puritanism, these distinct boundaries do not really exist. Given that most of these practices and shrines developed over thousands of years, borrowing and adopting from different religious sources, such syncretism is not extraordinary per se. For the longest period in history, interaction between different villages and cities remained limited because of hostile roots and no other medium of communication. Therefore, when Islam was introduced to people here, it was understood in a language that was already available to the locals through existing religious practices. Throughout the time that communication remained limited, such practices thrived, reconfiguring old traditions and mixing up new ones to present something unique in their own regard. However, that changed after the creation of Pakistan, built on the concept of its exclusivity from Hinduism. In the changing atmosphere, these syncretistic practices found themselves in a precarious place, defying the exclusive separatist nationalism. It is primarily for this reason that such idiosyncratic shrines become extraordinary, a repository of tradition that is no longer acceptable, yet prevalent throughout the country. In other words, the shrines are extraordinary because they continue to survive in an environment constructed out of Muslim separatism.
So it's become a form of resistance, basically.
Yeah. But unfortunately, that's also changing now. Even these shrines, how they interpret their own traditions, is very aligned with the nationalistic.
They're getting co-opted as well, to a large degree. Yeah.
While this syncretism fascinates me, its impure past attracts the wrath of the religious and nationalist Puritans. Earlier, this threat came in the form of education and development, but now it is physical with the rise of Islamic militancy. Over the years, several such Sufi shrines have been bombed by militants as they hurt their religious sensibilities. The elite, who do not present a physical danger to the militants, however, look down upon such practices believed to be not reflective of pure Islam. A couple of years ago, I was sitting across from a panel of educated Pakistanis being interviewed for a foreign scholarship. During the course of the interview, a discussion on the culture of Pakistan emerged. In order to impress the interviewers, I told them about the shrines of phallic offerings. But that's not true Islam, said one of the women on the panel. What is then? I asked her. That which is followed in Saudi Arabia, or which is followed by the Taliban, or that which is practiced in Iran? That which is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah, she argued. All of them draw their legitimacy from the Quran, I replied. A few weeks later, I received a rejection letter for the scholarship.
Yeah, that was the end of the scholarship. You mentioned in this passage the importance of communication. Earlier, at the time of partition, and obviously before that also, we hadn't had this kind of information revolution, right? Yeah. Information didn't travel as fast as it does now. It's just very simple. I mean, things just took much longer to reach people, right? Given the situation today, where anything that I want to say, I can just go and pretty much put it up on the net, and well, I'm guessing not that many people will read it, but there's a potential that a lot of people will read it. So, it's a particularly powerful tool now that we have, which can be used which is already being used actually, to sort of propagate this puritanical Islam, but which can also be used for the counter-narratives, right? So, to your mind, and I think I'll probably give this question to you, Anam, because you've been working with younger people and students in particular. To your mind, how much does that information revolution matter right now? Is it helping to make Indians and Pakistanis amongst the younger generation recognize each other in a truer way, in a more humane way, in a more sympathetic way? Is it achieving the opposite? And specifically in terms of religious communities recognizing each other, if you want, you can take that part of it. What do you feel is the potential, and what do you feel is already happening because of the internet and all of that?
See, I think social media, at the end of the day, is a tool. Yeah. And it depends on how you use it. Now, unfortunately, what you're not going to see happening is someone coming from a very kind of rigid mindset, going on social media and saying, oh my God, that's what Indians really are, let's go across the border. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. The people, I mean, I'm a big fan of Aman Kiyasha, but the people who are part of that are also coming from a certain mindset already. Right. Certain exposure, certain income bracket, and all of that factors in, right? Yes, on one hand, it gives you more greater access, and it allows dialogue to go on uninterrupted until now. So I've been using, Skype to talk to a lot of children in India. And recently I had this conversation with a school in Mumbai, 7th graders, and there were about 30 of them. And I said, what comes to mind when I say Pakistan? And they were just quiet. And I said, it's okay, you won't offend me. And they said war and terrorism and Pakistanis stab you in the back and burqas and all of that. And we had a conversation for about an hour, and at the end of it, one child got up and said, now I know that all Pakistanis are not murderers, so I can think of going there too. So on one hand, it's beautiful, and you can achieve so much change. I mean, I can be sitting in Islamabad and kind of interacting. But on the other hand, I think what social media does is it's not censored, no one's accountable, right? So you can start a blog, and you can write whatever you want, really, and it's going to be up there. You will see when India-Pakistan are playing a cricket match, or an article comes out, you just need to see the commentary niche. Everyone's like, "Main uska baap hu, Pakistan mera bacha hai, India." So it's ridiculous. But you actually have children, and you have not just children, but you have young adults going there and reaffirming what they already believe about the other.
And then perhaps further entrenching their positions.
Because in India-Pakistan, you don't come across in India, most Indians will never come across a Pakistani. In Pakistan, not only will you not come across an Indian, you will not also come across a Hindu or a Sikh in your ordinary life, and I think especially in Punjab.
We also see that social media has the potential to create a certain type of toxicity also. It's not just about people interacting and getting to know each other better. There's a particular sort of badtamizi also that goes on social media, which one can get away with. I mean, just look at the stuff that some of the memes say. It can make a perfectly balanced person's blood boil, seeing some of the things that go up. So,
So that's absolutely, I mean, I'll let you answer the rest, but I'd love to just read a small passage from the children,
sure.
Maybe after.
No, go ahead, Abhi kar lo, because we're talking about that right now. And I also, based on what you were saying, what I was thinking at that time was, no, actually, it's not that easy for us to post anything we want. Because जैसे वो freedom build कर रहा है, उसके साथ we are also being surveyed so much. We know कि surveillance बहुत बढ़ गई है. We know that we are being monitored. We know that our communication is being read by someone or the other who thinks that our intentions are not all good, right?
Absolutely.
So is it worth it being able to Skype with people across the border when you know that Big Brother is watching? I don't know.
Big Brother's always
It's,
watching.
yeah, it's a little.
Just one other thing I like to say is part of the book focuses on textbooks and
Right.
education and the hate sentiment in Sindh textbooks and Punjab textbooks. And what I noticed in India was that they've gone through revisions. So something that's really good is that, you know, when you talk about partition, they'll actually use Urvashi Batalia's oral histories.
Right.
They'll talk about rescue stories, and then they'll talk about the violence was given a context. But an issue is that they skip. So you go from quit India to partition. And for an ordinary Indian child that I've also worked with, it's very, you don't understand the need for partition, and you think, we don't know what Pakistan was created, it was seen as a loss from the state, and then it became a terrorist country.
Right.
It's a very linear
So there are
narrative.
gaps in their understanding of
And
what
the
happened.
gaps are being filled through social media. So
Oh,
these
I
children are
see.
not just not thinking about it. They're going,
Right.
okay, so why did the Kashmir conflict happen?
Right.
Why did partition happen? Why is terrorism such a problem? And they're going online and they're finding stuff to reinforce the stereotypes.
Yeah,
So
which
that's
is
a
so
big
interesting
problem.
because I think that obviously India having much more, their society obviously has, I mean, they have their population being much bigger and minorities ki populations being so much bigger in India, they have more of a stake in actually keeping people together, keeping communities together. हमारे यहाँ उस तरह का pressure नहीं feel किया जाता, right? But you know, at the end of the day, when you have governments like the current government in India in power, right? I mean, I would be interested in seeing whether there are any further revisions in their textbooks.
They are already
during-
happening right now.
They're already
actually,
happening.
yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Once again, it's the state sort of, you know, forcing a particular type of narrative and then changing that collective memory that you were referring to earlier, you know, which then impinges upon local practices the way you've been seeing. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. If you could just read that, and then we'll actually move on to the question answer session. Yeah, I think we've been talking long enough.
So one of my colleagues, Mariam, a 22-year-old graduate from Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS, told me she had hated India. She had hated it so much that when her father was posted to Delhi as the defense attaché, she had told him, Abba, take us anywhere else in the world. Why does it have to be India? For months, she and her sisters dwelled in this misery. Her younger sister, Maham, would cry her eyes out every night. She would say, हम इंडिया क्यों जा रहे हैं? उधर तो सारे काफिर होते हैं, वो तो अच्छे नहीं होते. Why are we going to India? Only infidels live there. They aren't good people. Mariam was of a tender age of 5. Later, when they moved there, Mariam tells me an Indian neighbor would often visit. He was a Hindu who migrated from Mia Valley at partition. When he found out that we had moved to Delhi, he would visit us all the time. My dada, who was also from Mia Valley and had come to India with us, would sit every evening describing the city and his house to the neighbor, and he would always leave our place teary-eyed, only to return the next day to hear the same stories over and over again. I didn't understand why this neighbor would come over all the time. I used to think it was very annoying that this Hindu man was taking up our family time. Why was his home of 60 years ago so important to him? It's only now that I understand. After living in India for a few years, I began to let go of that hatred. I became friends with Indians. Today I can't go back because of my father's military past. There are just too many security complications to get through, and that hurts. This man had lived in Mia Valley for most of his life. I don't know how much it must have hurt him to not be able to go back, but at that time I just didn't get it. I just didn't understand why my dada would invite him over and over again. Another student I worked with in a school had started crying hysterically when I passed around a picture of a Hindu deity. She was in class 6, studying in an upper middle class school in Lahore that I worked in. When I asked her what happened, she told me her eyes had sinned, that she would now go to hell because of what she had seen. Later that year, when I took a few students with me to India for the Citizens Archive of Pakistan's exchange project, one of the Indian schools had received us with garlands and music. The principal had moved forward to place a tika on our foreheads. 3 of the Pakistani students had begun to cry. They turned and asked me if this meant they had become Hindu. They said they had heard Hindus would forcibly convert Muslims to their religion. Was this their fate too? And then just a little bit from India. On one of my recent trips, I visited a high-income school in the posh Mutunga area of Mumbai, as well as a low-income one in Dharavi, known to be the largest slum in Asia. In both schools, despite the vast class difference, the students were completely baffled by me. How come you're wearing jeans? How is your English so good? Have you seen the terrorist Hafiz Saeed? As I struggled to answer these questions in a way that would present an accurate picture of Pakistan while clearing many of the misconceptions, a young child of no more than 6 years of age ran up to me. Holding up my visitor's tag, he asked, "Visitor, visitor, where are you from?" When he was unable to guess, I finally gave in and told him Pakistan. His eyes widened instantly, and clutching his school bag across his chest, he turned on his heel and began to run. I yelled after him and asked, "What happened?" Looking back, he sheepishly said, "I'm scared of Ajmal Kasab."
ये देखिए.
A child of
Ye
such
dekhiye.
tender age had already made the equations in his head. Pakistani meant terrorist, fanatic, fundamentalist.
Yeah, yeah. Just one more thing, just to wrap this up from my end. During your trips, what was your view of the younger generations in these areas? Are they continuing their religious traditions the same way, or do you find them moving away more towards the puritanical versions of Islam?
No, they're definitely moving away. So,
They are.
Even the shrine of the dogs that I was mentioning, the younger guardians of the shrine are now more inclined to make their shrine more orthodox.
Right.
Something very similar I observed at Fallow Offering. The same people whose ancestors have upheld those traditions, because these people are now educated in a particular way through the media and the education system. They kind of now want to conform and make their shrines more aligned with the orthodoxy.
With the orthodoxy. Okay, all right. So I think we've gotten a clear sense of how things have developed over several decades, and in fact, in Haroon's case, centuries of religious practice, and with it then that potent injection of nationalism. How the two have worked together to affect communities in the urban areas and the rural areas, people in India and Pakistan, the old and the young, right? So I'd like to now open the floor to questions at this point. Farheen, what's the time? 8:40. We have really spoken for much longer than we were supposed to. So maybe we'll take, say, about three questions. Does that sound good? Okay. So, yeah.
What you said about Nepal was very fascinating because I've lived in Nepal for 5 years. My father worked over there. And I was lucky enough to go to college where I had a bunch of Nepali friends. And what you said, we couldn't have summed it up better when I would say, because Nepal is the only Hindu state in the world till the 2011 massacres and then became secular. But a lot of the Nepalis over there have always associated themselves. And I remember, and he'd be like, we're somewhat of an atheist, but we've picked and chosen what works for us. And the irony is that no matter the fact that Nepal was a huge Hindu state, there weren't that many, like there were, but it was not that, 95% of them are Hindus. They were all their own verticals. Buddhism had a huge thing because Burma was right next to it. That had a huge influence on it as well. And it was just fascinating. And what you said about the dog in Nepal, if you visited, every place, my mother would be like, "Shamari, and they would just stop, and the dogs would have to go everywhere. They would stop and worship them. And what I found fascinating, I went to the biggest Hindu temple in the world, Pashupatinath, is in Nepal. So, and I would see people, there was one version of like atheism and this, and the other would be, the women would take off jewelry, sona pehna hota tha, and they just threw it there. And it was said that apparently close to 4 to 5 million Indian rupees worth of money and gold used to go to this temple.
So we're seeing a particular process of capitalism also working through these. Right.
Amazing how religion had that aura of capitalism all around it. It was just awe-inspiring.
Right.
The only thing was there. So in Nepal, they were never told how to be a Hindu or how to be a Buddhist. And so they kind of developed their own indigenous identities, which we also did. But now then we were told how to be
They
Muslims.
took it very personally when it became a secular state, because it was the only Hindu state in the world. And then when it became a secular state, they would like protests and stuff like that. But it was no choice really.
Right. Now we're going to take a question from that side. And I hope it's a question. Yes, all right.
I think I can just bring it from here, right? I wanted to ask you, you both are researchers and you've both written books. When do you feel you've done enough research to make that book, readable? Or you think that that's just, a few opinions? Do you think it will? You're also in some ways influencing people, right? So when do you feel that you've done enough research to warrant a book?
It's a very difficult question, and one that I kept grappling with because I was writing on partition and it's largely based in and around Lahore and different cities in Punjab, and of course Sindh. That's a completely different ballgame altogether. I decided to go ahead and write the book because I felt the stories were too important not to be sharing at this point. And for me, it's an urgency because, like I read about the children, these are stories, the partition stories I was talking about earlier, they're not trickling down. And it was this urgency to share. And I think I knew that I had done enough because it had changed enough in me to question. Now, what you're going to come across in the book, if you read it, are more questions than answers, like Afia mentioned. And that was the objective of my book, to make people question. If I can do that, that's enough. I don't mean to preach. Yeah.
Ji, this lady also has a question. Yeah, that will be the last question then. Yeah.
After all your research and all the interviews you've done, what do you feel about partition? Do you think it's a mistake or?
I think that's a great question. Yes. Oh, tell us where you stand, Anam. No pressure.
No pressure. I was asked this question in India, which was much trickier. So yeah,
this is going to be a walk in the park.
Yeah, this is home. People have asked me a slightly different version of that question of whether I think partition should have happened or should not have happened, and if we should reunify. And what I keep saying is that it's not only tricky to answer it honestly, but it's also very difficult for me, almost 7 decades after partition, to say whether it was right or wrong. The only thing I've learned is that for a lot of people it made sense, for a lot of others it didn't, but the way it happened, it should not have. And the only person who's asked me that question was a 7th grade in Mumbai who said, if I could ask you, could partition have happened differently? How would you have liked that to happen? I thought it was a very interesting question. So it's not about whether it should have, whether it should not have, and whether we should go back, because our national identities are very much entrenched now. Bangladeshis feel very differently, Pakistanis feel differently, and Indians feel differently. But to perhaps ponder on where we went wrong and how we could have avoided that bloodshed. I think that's the question for me to reflect on, because yes,
everyone
they
played
did
their role.
Yeah.
Nobody, which book was it? I'm confused between the two. I think you were the one who mentioned, was it you? Sorry. The train that used to go through the jungle. That was your book, right?
Yeah.
The train that used to go through the jungle to go to the other side, to go to Pakistan, and how the driver was told to stop in the middle of the jungle, and then he would honk the horn of the train. So the Sikhs in that area knew that train ruki hui, and they would come and they would shoot everybody, and then the train would go on ahead to the border, right? The British never told them to do that, right? At the end of the day, it's about how people conducted themselves, So many.
It's just, but you see with blasphemy today in Pakistan, you see the partition as well. A lot of times, petty rivalries came out under the larger garb of partition.
Want property, you want
a lot of those were.
Or a rejected rishta or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, Asad. Go ahead.
My question for Anam. I read your book and I find it really fascinating. What I find really fascinating is sort of the style in which you've written the book, like the narrative style. It uses none of the academic jargon you'd normally expect researchers to use. So could you tell us a little about your stylistic preoccupations? I mean, is this generally how oral research is written?
I think the only reason I did this is I haven't done my PhD. So I'm not very educated and I'm not an academic, so I had to do it in a non-academic fashion. But also, the funny thing is I only read fiction traditionally, and I wrote a non-fiction book, and one of the reasons I find it difficult to read a lot of non-fiction is because of the jargon. And that's something I really didn't want to do. It's not objective research. Right? I'm very subjective, my biases are there, my own curiosity is there, and I'm kind of trying to be upfront with it. And I think that was important, because I'm not trying to say partition was right or wrong or this or that. I'm trying to say, well, it happened, and it happened in a much more vast sense than we know and we learn. So I just wanted to put forward those questions through a personal journey. Yeah.
Okay, great. What next for both of you? Just tell us quickly. What's the plan?
I'm writing a book on Kashmir, which hopefully will be released next year by HarperCollins.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic. And Haroon, for you?
My new book is coming by the end of this year. It's a book on Guru Nanak. So I've traveled all over Pakistan.
Would you just
with him.
stop? Just slow down. This is really something. That's amazing. Both of you are amazing. I think it's fantastic that you're doing what you're doing. You're reclaiming a very important part of our history. And I think it's really, really important, your work. And I wish you all the best. Best of luck for what you're doing. Farheen just has to announce something.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'd just like to tell you that Anam's book, The Footprints of Partition, and Haroon's book, In Search of Shiva, are available for sale at the table over there. And the authors are here to sign the books also. So that's one thing. And secondly, this event would not have been possible without the amazing team of T2F, who are always there for us whenever we want them. And if we want such events and more amazing events that they have here to continue, we need to play our role, and that role can be in the form of donation. The donation box is right at the back. We have a responsibility towards, as Karachiites, to keep the doors of T2F open. Don't let them close. And on that note, thank you once again, guys, for being here. It was a lovely evening. Thank you.